August 21st, 1914. The Western Front, somewhere in northeastern France. Private Heinrich Müller huddles in a trench, his hands still shaking from the morning's artillery barrage. It's been 2 weeks since Germany invaded Belgium. 2 weeks since the world erupted into war. He's already seen more death than he ever imagined possible. But what's about to happen has nothing to do with the war, and it will terrify him more than any artillery shell. It's early afternoon. The sun is high, but something strange is happening. The light is fading. Not like sunset. There's no golden glow, no gradual dimming. The light is just disappearing. Birds begin acting strangely, flying erratically, some falling silent. The temperature drops noticeably. Men on both sides of no man's land look up at the sky. The moon is eating the sun. In his diary, Müller will later write, "We thought God had finally seen enough. That he was ending the world because of what we'd done to each other." Some men fell to their knees. Others began praying out loud. I heard French voices across the lines doing the same. For 3 minutes, enemies became nothing more than terrified humans under a dead sun. This is the story of one of the strangest moments in World War I, a day when nature intervened in the most devastating war the world had yet seen. A day when soldiers who'd been trying to kill each other moments before stood paralyzed by cosmic fear. A day when military operations paused not because of strategy or tactics, but because the sun disappeared from the sky. This is the story of the Great War's forgotten solar eclipse. And what happened during those minutes of darkness reveals something profound about the men who fought, the war that consumed them, and the thin line between civilization and superstition. To understand what the eclipse meant to the soldiers who witnessed it, we need to understand the war they were fighting and how quickly their world had fallen apart. June 28th, 1914. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria is shot in Sarajevo by a Serbian nationalist. It's a political assassination that seems, initially, like a regional crisis. Europe has survived many such crises, but this time, the system of alliances and imperial rivalries that have been building for decades finally collapses. Like dominoes falling, one declaration of war triggers another. Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Russia mobilizes to support Serbia. Germany declares war on Russia, then on France. German troops march through Belgium. Britain declares war on Germany to honor its treaty with Belgium. By early August 1914, all of Europe's great powers are at war. And this isn't a limited war over territory or colonies. This is something unprecedented. Industrial warfare fought with modern weapons, but with tactics from an earlier era. The soldiers marching off to war in August 1914 don't know what's coming. The prevailing belief is that the war will be over by Christmas. Soldiers on all sides believe they're fighting a righteous cause. They march with flags and music, cheered by crowds who think war is glorious. They're about to learn otherwise. The German army executes the Schlieffen Plan, a massive sweep through Belgium and northern France, designed to quickly knock France out of the war before Russia can fully mobilize. It's an ambitious plan that requires precise timing and assumes everything will go according to schedule. It doesn't. The German advance meets fierce resistance from Belgian forces who weren't supposed to fight back this hard. British expeditionary forces arrive in France faster than expected. The French army, reeling from initial defeats, regroups and counterattacks. By mid-August 1914, just 2 weeks into the war, hundreds of thousands of soldiers are engaged in running battles across Belgium and northeastern France. The fighting is chaotic, brutal, and unlike anything the army's trained for. This isn't the war anyone expected. There are no decisive cavalry charges, no quick victories, just endless marching, sporadic fierce battles, mass casualties, and exhausted men trying to understand what's happening. The soldiers are learning a terrible lesson about modern war. Artillery can kill you from miles away. Machine guns can cut down entire companies in minutes. And the romantic notions of glory and heroism are being ground into mud and blood. Private Heinrich Müller, our German soldier from the opening, is part of the First Army under General Alexander von Kluck. His regiment has been marching and fighting almost continuously since crossing into Belgium. He's 22 years old. He was studying engineering before the war. Now he's learning how to survive artillery barrages and how to sleep in the rain. His letters, home, before military censorship becomes strict, talk about being tired, about the constant sound of artillery, about friends wounded or killed. There's confusion about where they are and where they're going. Orders change constantly. The quick victory everyone expected isn't happening. On the French side, Corporal Jean Moreau is experiencing the same chaos from the other perspective. He's part of a French infantry regiment that's been in retreat since the war began. fighting delaying actions, trying to slow the German advance. He writes in his diary about the surreal experience of seeing his country invaded, of passing through, villages abandoned by civilians, of the constant exhaustion. British soldier Private Thomas Atkins, yes, that's actually his name, the inspiration for Tommy as slang for British soldiers, is with the British Expeditionary Force. He describes the war as nothing like we trained for. The orderly battle plans learned in training have dissolved into chaos. His regiment fights a battle one day, marches 20 miles the next, fights another battle, retreats, advances. There's no clear pattern, just survival day by day. These three men, German, French and British, are fighting in the same general area of northeastern France in mid-August 1914. None of them know each other. Under normal circumstances, they'd have no reason to share any experience. But on August 21st, something will connect their experiences in a way that transcends nationality or allegiance. They'll all witness the same astronomical event, and they'll all react with similar terror and wonder, because despite their uniforms, despite the propaganda, despite being told they're enemies, they're all human beings confronting something their ancestors thought was supernatural: the death and resurrection of the sun. Before we get to August 21st, we need to understand both what a solar eclipse actually is and what people in 1914 believed about them. The science is straightforward. A solar eclipse occurs when the moon passes between the Earth and the sun, casting a shadow on Earth's surface. During a total solar eclipse, the moon completely covers the sun, and the sky goes dark even in the middle of the day. The eclipse of August 23rd, 1914, was a total solar eclipse with a path of totality, where the eclipse is complete, crossing through Scandinavia and Eastern Europe before sweeping across the Baltic and into Russia. But a partial eclipse, where the moon covers most but not all of the sun, was visible across a much wider area, including the Western Front where the fighting was fiercest. Astronomers knew this eclipse was coming. It had been predicted years in advance. In peacetime, it would have been a major scientific event, with expeditions organized to observe it from the best vantage points. But August 1914 wasn't peacetime. The astronomical community's preparations for the eclipse had been completely disrupted by the outbreak of war. Scientists who would have been collaborating were now citizens of enemy nations. Observation sites in the path of totality were in war zones. Some astronomers tried to continue their work despite the war. There are records of Russian astronomers traveling to optimal observation points, treating the eclipse as a scientific opportunity that transcended the political chaos. German and British astronomers published papers about the eclipse. Though given the timing, most of their observations were rushed and limited. But for the vast majority of people, especially soldiers at the front, there was no advance warning. Military units had more pressing concerns than astronomical events. Newspapers that might have reported on the upcoming eclipse were focused entirely on war news. And even if soldiers had known an eclipse was coming, many wouldn't have understood what that meant. Because here's the crucial thing. In 1914, public scientific literacy is limited. These are men from rural villages, small towns, industrial cities. Many have only basic education. Their understanding of astronomy is vague at best. More importantly, they're living in a time when superstition and folk beliefs are still powerful. Rural Europe in 1914 is full of people who believe in omens, prophetic dreams, folk magic, and divine intervention. The division between the scientific worldview and traditional beliefs isn't as sharp as it would become later in the 20th century. Solar eclipses have always terrified humans. Ancient civilizations created elaborate myths to explain them. The ancient Chinese believed a dragon was devouring the sun. Norse mythology described wolves chasing and catching the sun. Many cultures saw eclipses as omens of disaster, divine punishment, or signs that the gods were angry. Even in more recent European history, eclipses were viewed with fear. There are documented cases of panic during 18th and 19th century eclipses, of people interpreting them as signs of the apocalypse or divine judgment. By 1914, educated people in cities understand that eclipses are natural astronomical events. But soldiers at the front aren't educated astronomers in comfortable universities. They're exhausted, traumatized young men, many from traditional rural backgrounds, fighting in conditions of constant stress and fear. They've already seen their world turned upside down. The peaceful Europe they knew just weeks ago has become a nightmare of industrial violence. Friends have been killed by invisible artillery. Comrades have been cut down by machine guns they never saw. The rules of civilization seem to have dissolved. And now, on an ordinary afternoon, the sun is disappearing from the sky. For men whose psychological defenses are already strained to the breaking point, this isn't just an astronomical curiosity. It's existentially terrifying. German soldier Müller's diary captures this visceral fear. We'd been told the world was rational, that science explained everything. But when the sun dies in the middle of the day while you're standing in a trench, surrounded by corpses, rationality doesn't feel very reliable. French Corporal Moreau writes something similar. The officers tried to explain it was natural, predictable, but their voices shook. And anyway, what's natural about the sun going dark? It felt like God withdrawing his light from the world, and who could blame him, given what we'd been doing to each other? This is the psychological context when the eclipse arrives on August 21st. Armies of exhausted, traumatized men, many holding on to traditional beliefs, all of them pushed to their psychological limits. They're not in a state of mind to appreciate astronomical phenomena. They're barely holding on to sanity, and they're about to experience 3 minutes of darkness at midday. The morning of August 21st starts like any other day on the Western Front, which means it starts with violence. German forces are continuing their advance through northeastern France. French and British forces are fighting delaying actions, trying to slow the German advance while avoiding being encircled. The Battle of Charleroi has just ended. The Battle of Mons is about to begin. Everywhere along the front, men are marching, fighting, dying. Heinrich Müller's regiment is positioned near the Belgian-French border. They've been in combat for 3 days straight. The morning brings another artillery exchange. Men die. The survivors keep fighting because there's nothing else to do. Jean Moreau's French unit is falling back, but it's an orderly retreat. His officers are maintaining discipline, making the Germans pay for every mile of ground they take. His diary entry from the morning mentions exhaustion and the strange disconnect of beautiful summer weather while they're fighting for their lives. Thomas Atkins and his British unit are moving to reinforce positions around Mons. He describes marching through abandoned villages, the eerie quiet broken by distant artillery. Everything feels surreal, like the normal world has ended and been replaced by something from a nightmare. None of them mention anything about an eclipse. Why would they? Even if they'd known one was predicted, it would have seemed irrelevant compared to staying alive. Around 1 p.m. local time, some soldiers notice the light changing. At first, it's subtle. The sunlight takes on an odd quality, slightly dimmer, with a strange color that's hard to describe. The partial eclipse is beginning. Over the next hour, the moon continues moving across the face of the sun. The light keeps fading. It's not like clouds covering the sun. The sky is clear, but the daylight is steadily dimming. Animals sense something is wrong. Horses become restless. Dogs with the medical unit start behaving strangely. Birds that would normally be active in the afternoon begin settling as if evening is approaching. Men start looking up at the sky, confused. Some of the more educated soldiers or officers realize what's happening. It's an eclipse, they tell their men. It's natural. The moon is passing in front of the sun. But explaining doesn't remove the primal fear, because the light keeps fading, and fading, and fading. At approximately 2 p.m., the eclipse reaches its maximum for the Western Front region. It's not total. The path of totality is much further northeast, but the sun is about 80% covered by the moon. The effect is dramatic. The daylight dims to something like deep twilight. Shadows become strange and sharp. The temperature drops noticeably, from a warm August afternoon to a sudden chill. The sky takes on an eerie bronze color, and across the Western Front, from Belgium through northeastern France, fighting stops. This isn't coordinated. No orders are given. But on both sides of the lines, soldiers stop shooting. Artillery fire slows and then ceases. Men stand in trenches or in open fields, staring at the dying sun. Müller describes the moment. The bombardment just stopped. Both sides. It wasn't a ceasefire, nothing official. But when the sun started dying, nobody wanted to shoot. We all just stood there, Germans and French, watching the same sky darken. Some men were crying, others praying. A few tried to laugh it off, but you could hear the fear in their voices. Moreau's account is similar. The officers were shouting that it was natural, nothing to fear, but even they looked terrified. One of our lieutenants, a man from Paris who'd been educated at the Sorbonne, was explaining the astronomy, but his hands were shaking as he spoke. Science is one thing when you're safe in a classroom. It's another when you're standing in mud stained with your friend's blood, and the sun is being extinguished. British soldier Atkins writes, I'd heard about eclipses, knew they were natural, but knowing something in your head is different from experiencing it. When that darkness came, when the temperature dropped and the air went still, every instinct in my body was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Men who'd faced German artillery without flinching were on their knees praying. The 3 minutes of maximum eclipse feel longer. Time distorts when you're terrified. Some soldiers interpret the eclipse religiously. They see it as God's judgment on the war, a sign that humanity has gone too far. In both Christian and Muslim units, remember, the French army included colonial troops from North Africa. Men pray loudly, asking for forgiveness. Other soldiers interpret it as an omen. Various superstitions circulate. The eclipse means the war will end soon, or it means terrible suffering is coming, or it's a sign that their side will win or lose. In trenches and in field positions, men share half-remembered folk beliefs about eclipses. Still others try to maintain a rational perspective. Officers in particular try to project calm, explaining the astronomy, insisting there's nothing supernatural happening. But maintaining rationality in these circumstances is difficult. Because this isn't just an eclipse happening in peacetime, where you can watch it safely and marvel at nature. This is an eclipse happening during the most destructive war in human history, up to that point, witnessed by men who are already traumatized, exhausted, and confronting death daily. The psychological impact is profound. Then, gradually, the moon continues its passage. The light returns. The bronze color fades. Normal daylight resumes. The temperature rises again. Birds resume their normal behavior. The eclipse is over, and slowly, reluctantly, the war resumes. After the eclipse passes, something remarkable happens. Almost nothing. By which I mean, military operations resume. The war continues. Officers give orders. Soldiers obey. The massive machine of industrial warfare chugs back into motion as if nothing happened. But in personal letters, diaries, and later memoirs, soldiers reveal that something significant did happen during those minutes of darkness. It broke through the psychological armor they'd been building to cope with the war. Muller's diary reflects this. After the sun came back, we returned to the fighting. Orders were orders, but something had changed. For those 3 minutes, we weren't soldiers anymore. We were just terrified humans who'd witnessed something beyond our understanding. The French across from us had felt the same thing we felt. We'd shared that moment of cosmic terror. And then we went back to trying to kill each other. That felt insane in a way that nothing before had felt insane. This sentiment appears repeatedly in soldiers' accounts. The eclipse created a moment of shared humanity across enemy lines. Germans, French, and British had all looked at the same darkening sky with the same fear. Nationality and uniform hadn't mattered during those minutes. And then they'd returned to the business of war. The psychological dissonance was profound for many soldiers. How do you process the fact that you shared a moment of existential terror with men you're supposed to hate, and then immediately resumed, trying to kill them? Some soldiers processed it through religion. The eclipse became, in their minds, a reminder of God's power and a call to maintain faith despite the horror of war. Military chaplains on all sides used the eclipse in their sermons as an example of divine providence, or a reminder of human insignificance in the face of cosmic forces. Other soldiers processed it through superstition. The eclipse became woven into the war's folklore. Years later, veterans would reference it when talking about omens or signs. I knew it would be a bad day when I saw that crow would be followed by, like the eclipse in 14, you know. The eclipse became a reference point for supernatural events, even though it was entirely natural. Still others tried to maintain a rational perspective. These soldiers, often the better educated from urban backgrounds, wrote about the eclipse as an interesting astronomical event that unfortunately coincided with terrible circumstances. They noted the irony that a predicted scientific phenomenon could cause such irrational fear, but even the rationalists admitted it had affected them. British officer John Reginald Colville wrote, "I understood perfectly well what was causing the phenomenon. I'd read about the eclipse before the war began, but understanding didn't prevent the visceral response when the sunlight faded. Reason is a thin veneer over much older instincts." Officially, the military response to the eclipse was silence. This wasn't because of any conspiracy or cover-up. It simply wasn't considered militarily significant. After-action reports from August 21st mention enemy positions, artillery exchanges, casualties, tactical movements. None of them mention an eclipse. Why would they? It didn't change the strategic situation. No ground was gained or lost because of the eclipse. The war's momentum continued unchanged. But this official silence meant that the eclipse's impact on soldiers was never officially acknowledged. There was no recognition that hundreds of thousands of men had experienced a moment of profound psychological disruption. No attempt to address the emotional or spiritual impact. Soldiers were left to process the experience on their own, through personal letters and diaries that wouldn't be widely read until decades later, if ever. This pattern, soldiers experiencing something psychologically significant while the military machine ignores it, is characteristic of World War I. The war was producing trauma on an unprecedented scale, but there was no framework for addressing it. The term shell shock wouldn't be widely recognized until 1915, and even then it was poorly understood. The eclipse was just one more thing that soldiers had to process and internalize without support, adding to the psychological burden they were already carrying. In some units, the eclipse became part of collective memory. Veterans who served together would reference it in later reunions. Remember when the sun died? Became a shared touchstone, a moment that defined their experience of the war's early days. In other units, especially those where casualties were high and few of the original soldiers survived, the memory of the eclipse faded. So many other terrible things happened in the following years that one afternoon of darkness seemed less significant in retrospect. But for individuals who witnessed it, the eclipse often remained vivid. Muller, writing in the 1950s about his war experiences, devoted several pages to the eclipse. "I saw terrible things in 4 years of war," he wrote, "but the eclipse haunted me in a different way. It was the moment when the rational world I'd believed in showed itself to be fragile. If the sun could die in the middle of the day, what else was possible?" The 1914 eclipse wasn't the first time a solar eclipse coincided with warfare, and it wouldn't be the last. Looking at the historical pattern reveals something fascinating about how humans respond when cosmic events intersect with human conflict. Ancient history is full of eclipses affecting battles. The most famous is probably the eclipse during the battle between the Medes and the Lydians in 585 BCE. According to the historian Herodotus, the two armies were engaged in fierce combat when a solar eclipse occurred. Both sides interpreted it as a divine sign and immediately made peace. The eclipse had been predicted by the Greek philosopher Thales, making it one of the first historically verified predictions of an eclipse. Whether the story is entirely accurate is debated by historians, but it illustrates how ancient peoples interpreted eclipses during warfare as interventions by the gods, signs to stop fighting, warnings that humans were displeasing the divine. During the Peloponnesian War, an eclipse in 413 BCE convinced the Athenian general Nicias to delay his retreat from Syracuse. The delay proved disastrous. His army was trapped and destroyed. An eclipse directly influenced military strategy with catastrophic results. Christopher Columbus famously used his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse in 1504 to intimidate hostile natives in Jamaica, claiming he could make the moon disappear. When the eclipse occurred as predicted, the natives were so frightened they provided the supplies Columbus needed. Astronomical knowledge being used as a weapon of psychological warfare. But these ancient and early modern examples are different from the 1914 eclipse in a crucial way. In ancient times, people universally viewed eclipses as supernatural. By 1914, everyone theoretically knew eclipses were natural phenomena. The psychological impact in 1914 came not from supernatural fear but from the collision between intellectual knowledge and visceral human response. The closest parallel to the 1914 eclipse might be the eclipses that occurred during the American Civil War. There were solar eclipses visible from parts of the United States in 1860 and 1869, though neither occurred during major battles. However, soldiers' letters mention these eclipses and the superstitious dread they created, even among men who intellectually understood the astronomy. One Union soldier wrote about an eclipse. "We know it is the moon's shadow, not God's hand. But when you're standing on a battlefield where thousands have died, and the light goes out of the sky, knowledge seems less certain than it did in peacetime." This is the key insight. Rational knowledge doesn't eliminate emotional response, especially in extreme circumstances. After 1914, there were other eclipses during times of war, but none quite matched the circumstances of August 21, 1914. There was a total solar eclipse visible from parts of Europe on June 29, 1927, during peacetime, but in a Europe still traumatized by World War I. Reports from the time describe how veterans reacted to this eclipse, some experiencing flashbacks to 1914. During World War II, several eclipses occurred, but none crossed major battle zones at critical moments. There was a total solar eclipse on September 21, 1941, visible from parts of the Soviet Union and China, both war zones at the time, but documentation is limited. The Soviets were fighting desperately against the German invasion, and recording astronomical phenomena wasn't a priority. The pattern across history suggests that eclipses during wartime have a special psychological impact because they combine cosmic scale with human conflict. The vast indifference of the universe intersecting with the most intense human experiences creates a moment of perspective that can be either terrifying or enlightening. For the soldiers of August 1914, Witnessing the eclipse while fighting one of history's most destructive wars created a moment of what we might call existential vertigo, a sudden awareness of how small human conflicts are against the backdrop of cosmic forces, combined with the realization that those cosmic forces don't care about human suffering. Müller captures this in his diary. The sun doesn't care about our war. The moon doesn't care if we live or die. The universe continues its ancient patterns while we kill each other in the mud. That should have been comforting. Our suffering is temporary, the cosmos is eternal. But instead it felt crushing. We mattered so little that even the sun could ignore us. This existential dimension of the 1914 eclipse separates it from both ancient eclipses, which were seen as divine messages, and modern eclipses, which are primarily scientific events. The 1914 eclipse occurred at a unique moment in human consciousness, when we knew enough to understand eclipses scientifically, but still felt emotionally connected to older, more primal responses. Let's return to our three soldiers and follow their stories beyond August 21st, because the eclipse didn't end their war. It was just one day in years of suffering. Heinrich Müller, our German soldier, survives August 1914. His regiment continues advancing into France, participating in the First Battle of the Marne in early September. The German advance is stopped, then pushed back. The race to the sea follows as both sides try to outflank each other. By October 1914, Müller is in trenches near Ypres. The war has transformed from mobile warfare into the static trench warfare that will define the Western Front. His diary entries become shorter, more matter-of-fact. The initial shock and horror give way to a kind of numbed acceptance. He mentions the eclipse only once more, in December 1914. We thought the darkened sun in August was the worst omen possible. We didn't know yet what was coming. The trenches are worse than any omen. This is hell, and we're living in it. Müller survives the first year of the war, then the second. He's wounded twice, returning to his unit after recovery. By 1916, he's a sergeant leading new young soldiers who are replacing the dead. He's 24 years old and feels ancient. In July 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, Müller is wounded badly enough that he's sent home. He survives the war, but returns to a Germany in political chaos, facing economic collapse and revolution. His post-war diary entries are bitter. We survived the eclipse. We survived the battles, but I'm not sure we survived the war. Something died in us. Jean Moreau, our French corporal, also survives the Battle of the Marne where the German advance is stopped. He fights in the First Battle of Ypres in October-November 1914. His regiment suffers 70% casualties. He's promoted to sergeant partly because so many superior officers have been killed. His diary becomes philosophical. Moreau had been religious before the war, but the experience is testing his faith. The eclipse features in his struggle. If God darkened the sun to warn us in August, why didn't we listen? Or was it a test we failed? Or is there no God, just the indifferent machinery of the universe grinding forward while we suffer below? By 1915, Moreau has stopped attending Mass when the opportunity arises. I can't pray to a God who allows this, he writes. But when his best friend is killed by artillery in March 1915, he finds himself praying anyway. I don't believe anymore, but I still pray. Human beings are contradictions. Moreau is badly wounded at Verdun in 1916, losing his left arm below the elbow. He survives but is medically discharged. He returns to his village in southern France, where he has to rebuild a life with physical disability and psychological trauma. In his 1920s diary entries, he writes about the difficulty of adjustment. The war ended, but it didn't end inside us. Sometimes I wake up thinking I'm in the trenches. The sound of thunder triggers panic. I can't explain to people here what it was like. They want heroes. They don't want the truth. Thomas Atkins, our British soldier, fights at the Battle of Mons in late August 1914, just days after the eclipse. The British Expeditionary Force fights a brilliant delaying action, but is heavily outnumbered and forced to retreat. Atkins' unit is nearly surrounded several times. He mentions the eclipse in a letter home in September. Dear Mother, you asked if we'd seen anything unusual. We saw the sun disappear from the sky in the middle of the day. We thought it was the end times, but the war continued, so I suppose even the Almighty hasn't worked out how to stop men from fighting. The letter is notable for its attempt at dark humour, a common coping mechanism among British soldiers, but other letters reveal his state of mind deteriorating. By late 1914, he's writing less frequently, and when he does write, it's about trivial things, avoiding any real description of his experiences. Atkins survives until July 1916, when he's killed during the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the bloodiest day in British military history. His body is never identified. He's commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial among 72,000 British and South African soldiers with no known grave. His final letter home, written a week before his death and published by his family after the war, includes this passage. I don't fear death anymore, Mother. After living through this, death seems like rest. I dream sometimes of that day the sun went dark. In the dream, it stays dark, and the fighting stops, and we all go home. But then I wake up, and the sun is shining, and the war continues. These three stories, one German, one French, one British, represent millions of similar stories. The eclipse was just one day in years of horror. For some soldiers, it remained psychologically significant. For others, it faded into memory against the backdrop of greater traumas. But collectively, these personal stories reveal something important. The eclipse mattered to the men who experienced it. Even if it didn't matter to the war's outcome, it was a shared human moment in the midst of inhuman circumstances. And in the letters and diaries that survive, the eclipse appears repeatedly as a reference point, a moment when something broke, through the psychological numbness of war, and reminded soldiers of a larger universe beyond the trenches. After the war ended in November 1918, survivors faced the challenge of processing what they'd experienced and explaining it to people who hadn't been there. The eclipse became part of the war's mythology, though it's a lesser-known element compared to the major battles or the trench warfare that defined the Western Front. In veterans' associations and reunions in the 1920s and 30s, the eclipse was often mentioned. Were you there when the sun died? Became a way veterans identified each other. If you answered yes, you'd been at the front in those early weeks of the war, which had a certain mystique among veterans. War memoirs published in the interwar period occasionally mentioned the eclipse. Some authors used it symbolically, the darkness during the eclipse representing the darkness descending on Europe with the war. Others mentioned it more matter-of-factly as an unusual event that occurred during their service. Poet Wilfred Owen, though he wasn't at the front in August 1914, he enlisted later, wrote about the eclipse based on stories he'd heard from fellow soldiers. His poem 1914 includes the lines, "War broke, and now the winter of the world with perishing great darkness closes in. The sun, which in our grandsire's time stood high at noon, now stands eclipsed and will not rise." Owen is using the eclipse metaphorically, but he's drawing on the actual experience of soldiers who witnessed it. The eclipse also appeared in visual art by veterans. Several paintings from the 1920s depict soldiers in trenches under a darkened sun. The symbolism is heavy: the lost generation, the death of European civilization, the darkness of war, but it's rooted in an actual astronomical event. Interestingly, the eclipse received little attention in official military histories. The major military history of World War I's early campaigns, published in the 1920s and 30s, barely mention it. It wasn't considered strategically significant, but in soldiers' oral histories and personal testimonies, it remained prominent. The Imperial War Museum in London has dozens of interviews with veterans from the 1970s and 80s, men in their 80s and 90s, recounting experiences from 60-plus years earlier. Many mention the eclipse, describing it with remarkable clarity despite the passage of time. One veteran, interviewed in 1982, said, "I can't remember the names of half the men in my platoon. I can't remember most of the battles clearly. They blur together, but I remember that eclipse as clearly as if it happened yesterday. The way the light changed, the temperature dropping, the fear on everyone's face, that stays with you." This raises an interesting question about memory and trauma. Why did the eclipse remain so vivid when other experiences faded? Psychologists who study trauma have noted that unusual emotionally charged events often form especially strong memories. The eclipse combined novelty — most soldiers had never experienced an eclipse — emotional intensity, existential fear, and a kind of beauty. Even terrified soldiers noted the strange aesthetics of the darkened sky. Moreover, the eclipse was a shared experience across enemy lines, unlike most wartime experiences which divided men by nationality and allegiance. The eclipse united them in a common human response. This may have made it psychologically unique and therefore more memorable. By World War II, the 1914 eclipse had become part of veteran folklore. Soldiers who were old enough to have fought in WWI and were still in service. In WTI would sometimes reference it when talking to younger soldiers about omens and signs. "I saw the sun die in 1914. One British officer told his men before D-Day, "We thought it meant the war would end soon. It didn't. Don't put faith in signs. Put faith in your training and your mates." The eclipse also became part of the broader cultural memory of World War I, though it's overshadowed by other symbols. Poppies, the unknown soldier, the war poets, the Christmas truce of 1914. The Christmas truce, where British and German soldiers spontaneously stopped fighting on Christmas Eve 1914 and played football in no man's land, became far more famous than the eclipse. This is partly because the Christmas truce fit a more appealing narrative. Human compassion triumphing over war, enemies recognizing their shared humanity. The eclipse offered a different, less comfortable message, that even in the face of cosmic events that should remind us of our insignificance and shared vulnerability, we return to war. The eclipse revealed our common humanity, and then we ignored that revelation. Perhaps that's why it never became as famous. The Christmas truce is a story we like to tell ourselves about human goodness. The eclipse is a story about human stubbornness and our ability to ignore even the clearest signs. In the 21st century, the 1914 eclipse is largely forgotten outside of specialized historical works. Most people learning about World War I don't hear about it. It's absent from most textbooks, documentaries, and popular histories of the war. This video, in fact, might be one of the first times many of you have heard about it. And that's a shame, because the eclipse story reveals something important about the war and about human nature that the better-known stories sometimes miss. The 1914 eclipse shows us that, even in the midst of the most intense human conflict, nature continues its ancient patterns, indifferent to our suffering. It shows us that knowledge and superstition, rationality and emotion exist simultaneously in human consciousness. We can understand something scientifically while still responding to it emotionally and primitively. Most importantly, it shows us that shared human experiences can transcend conflict and enmity, but that recognition of our common humanity isn't always enough to stop us from fighting. So what do we ultimately take from the story of the forgotten eclipse of August 21st, 1914? First, we're reminded that history is full of moments that don't fit the conventional narrative. Military history focuses on battles, strategies, leaders, and outcomes. But the human experience of war includes all sorts of moments that don't affect military outcomes but profoundly affect the people living through them. The eclipse didn't change the course of World War I. The German advance would have been stopped at the Marne regardless. The war would have descended into trench warfare, whether or not the moon passed in front of the sun that August afternoon. But for the hundreds of thousands of men who witnessed it, the eclipse was a defining moment. It broke through their psychological defenses and forced them to confront both the vastness of the universe and their own fragility. Second, we learn something about the relationship between knowledge and emotion. The soldiers of 1914 were transitioning between worldviews. They had enough education to understand that eclipses were natural phenomena, but not enough psychological framework to prevent primal fear when confronted with one. This is still relevant today. We live in a scientific age where we can explain almost anything that occurs in nature. But explanation doesn't eliminate emotional response. Understanding that turbulence is just air currents doesn't make a rough airplane flight less frightening. Knowing that thunder is just sound waves doesn't prevent the startled response. The 1914 eclipse reminds us that humans are both rational and emotional creatures, and sometimes those aspects of our nature conflict. Third, we see how shared experiences can create unexpected connections across divides. For 3 minutes, German, French, and British soldiers weren't enemies. They were humans, witnessing the same cosmic event with the same fear and wonder. That should have mattered more than it did. That moment of shared humanity should have made it harder to resume fighting, but it didn't. At least not enough to stop the war. This is perhaps the saddest lesson of the eclipse. Recognition of common humanity isn't always sufficient to overcome the forces, political, social, military, that drive conflict. We can see ourselves in our enemies and still fight them. We can share moments of profound connection and still return to violence. But maybe, and this is more hopeful, those moments of recognition matter in ways that aren't immediately visible. Maybe some of the soldiers who shared the eclipse experience were slightly less willing to dehumanize the enemy afterward. Maybe that moment of cosmic perspective saved a few lives here and there, in ways that didn't get recorded in official histories. We can't know. What we do know is that the men who witnessed it remembered it, and memory matters. Finally, the eclipse story reminds us of the power of perspective. The soldiers in August 1914 were absorbed in their immediate circumstances, survival, following orders, fighting the enemy. The eclipse forced them, however briefly, to look beyond those immediate concerns to the larger universe. From the perspective of the cosmos, the war, all wars, are insignificant. The sun doesn't care about human conflicts. The universe continues its ancient patterns regardless of what we do to each other. That perspective could be crushing or liberating, depending on how you receive it. For some soldiers, it was crushing. We matter so little that even the sun ignores our suffering. For others, it was strangely comforting. Our suffering is temporary, but the universe endures. Heinrich Müller, writing decades after the war, reflected on this. I've spent years trying to understand what the eclipse meant. I don't think it meant anything in a cosmic sense. The moon passes in front of the sun because of orbital mechanics, not because God is sending messages. But for us, standing in those trenches, it meant we were forced to remember that there's a universe beyond the war. That helped some of us survive, knowing that somewhere the sun was still shining. The sun did keep shining. The eclipse ended. The moon moved on. Light returned to the battlefield, and the war continued for 4 more years, killing millions more, traumatizing millions more, reshaping the world in ways that still affect us today. But for 3 minutes, on August 21st, 1914, men on both sides of the conflict looked at the same darkening sky and felt the same human response. They were connected by their shared vulnerability, their shared fear, their shared wonder at forces larger than themselves. That's worth remembering, not because it changed the war's outcome, but because it reveals something essential about human nature. We can be at war and still recognize our common humanity. We can be enemies and still share profound experiences. We can understand that cosmic forces dwarf our conflicts and still continue those conflicts anyway. We're complicated creatures, capable of both violence and empathy, rational thought and primal fear, continuing ancient hatreds and transcending them in moments of clarity. The forgotten eclipse of 1914 captures all of that complexity in one afternoon. The day the sun went dark wasn't the day the war ended. It wasn't even the day the war paused for any significant time. It was just a day when nature reminded soldiers of something they'd temporarily forgotten, that they were small, vulnerable humans living on a small planet, circling an ordinary star in an uncaring universe. And then the light returned, and they went back to war. If you found this forgotten chapter of history as fascinating as I did uncovering it, please hit that like button and subscribe. We specialize in finding the stories that fall through the cracks, the moments that matter to people, but not to military strategy, the human experiences behind historical events, the forgotten details that reveal deeper truths. Drop a comment below. Had you heard about this eclipse before? If you'd been a soldier on the Western Front that day, how do you think you would have reacted? Would rational knowledge have been enough to prevent fear? Share this with anyone who loves World War I history, anyone interested in the intersection of human conflict and natural phenomena, or anyone who appreciates stories about the messy reality of being human. Because that's what this story is ultimately about, not astronomy or military history specifically, but what it means to be human in extreme circumstances, to carry scientific knowledge and primitive superstitions simultaneously, to recognize shared humanity with enemies and then return to fighting them, to witness cosmic events while living through human catastrophe. The sun went dark on August 21st, 1914. But it rose again the next day, and the day after that, and every day since. The eclipse is forgotten, but it happened. The soldiers who witnessed it are gone, but their testimony remains in letters and diaries and memories. And somewhere in those testimonies is a truth about human nature that's still relevant today. We're capable of seeing beyond our immediate conflicts to larger perspectives, but that vision is fleeting, and we often return to our conflicts anyway. The challenge is to hold on to those moments of clarity, to remember what the eclipse taught those soldiers, that we're all under the same sky, living brief lives on a planet that doesn't care about our divisions. The sun rises for all of us. The moon casts its shadow on all of us. We're more alike than we are different. The soldiers of 1914 learned that lesson for 3 minutes, and then they went back to war. We have the opportunity to learn it permanently, to remember that our conflicts are tiny against the backdrop of the cosmos, that our common humanity transcends our divisions, that the universe offers us perspective if we're willing to accept it. The day the sun went dark was forgotten, but maybe it shouldn't be. Maybe we need stories like this to remind us that even in the darkest moments, literal or metaphorical, the light returns. And what we choose to do when the light returns defines us more than the darkness ever could.